Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's Notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil for yet another engaging conversation.
Welcome to the deep dive. We're diving into a pretty fascinating topic today. The evolution of sexual norms throughout history and across cultures.
Yeah.
That's the big one. But we've got some interesting source material to sort through it all.
Yes.
Yeah.
You've provided quite a range of sources, from scholarly articles on ancient civilizations to analyses of modern digital trends. So it's a pretty broad exploration we're going to do of this, ever-changing aspect of human experience.
Right. So one of the things that really stands out is, there's no single universal story.
Yeah.
When it comes to sexual norms. We see throughout history in different cultures just this huge diversity of attitudes and practices.
Absolutely. I think it's a misconception to assume that all ancient societies had, like one monolithic view of sexuality. Because the reality is, even way back then, there was a whole spectrum of attitudes and behaviors, related to sex.
Yeah, like, for example, ancient Egypt. The sources paint a picture of a culture that was really remarkably open about sexuality.
Right.
And fertility was like a central theme in their mythology, their art, their religious practices.
Yeah. The ancient Egyptians, they really saw sexuality as natural, as an integral part of life. Their gods and goddesses, like Osiris and Isis, they often embody fertility and rebirth, and their art frequently depicts, quite explicit sexual scenes.
Yeah. It wasn't even just limited to, like, the divine, right?
Yeah.
There's evidence that suggests that sexual pleasure was, like, acknowledged and potentially even celebrated.
The Turin Erotic Papyrus, for example.
Yeah.
That's a really fascinating collection of illustrations, vignettes that depict various sexual acts. And it really suggests that, they had a fairly relaxed attitude towards sexuality.
But it's important to note that while they were open about sex, they still really valued fidelity within marriage.
Right.
Particularly among the upper classes.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's not like their openness meant complete sexual freedom.
Right.
They still have rules and expectations.
Right.
Particularly when it came to, keeping those family units and social hierarchies, strong.
Right. Now, moving on to ancient Greece, we find a very different set of norms.
Yeah.
Shaped by their own, philosophical, social, and spiritual ideas.
Right. Ancient Greek society, it presents a more complex and challenging picture, I think, especially for modern observers. One aspect that, people often focus on is the practice of pederasty.
So for those who aren't familiar with the term, pederasty refers to relationships between adult men and younger males, typically adolescents. It was a socially accepted institution in ancient Greece, and was often seen as a form of mentorship, education, even a rite of passage.
Yeah. It's important to understand this practice in its historical context. Athenian society, especially, really valued male relationships. And pederasty was seen as, this way to foster those bonds between older and younger men, to transmit knowledge, prepare boys for their roles as citizens.
Of course, looking back from a modern perspective, the power dynamics that are inherent in these relationships, they raise some pretty significant ethical concerns.
Of course, yeah.
But it's we have to try to avoid imposing our contemporary values onto the past and really try to understand the cultural logic behind such practices.
Right. I think it's crucial to be able to analyze and critique these historical practices, but we have to do it with an understanding of the time period and the social norms.
Right. Beyond pederasty, ancient Greece also had a pretty tolerant attitude, at least relatively, towards homosexual relationships between men.
Right. I mean, same-sex relationships were more accepted in some city-states than others, of course. And they were discussed pretty openly, in philosophical and literary works.
Right, like Plato even explored the concept of a higher form of love between men.
Right.
A love that was more than just physical.
Yeah.
And represented a deeper intellectual and spiritual connection.
Yeah, and those philosophical explorations show that even back then, they had lots of different understandings and interpretations of same-sex relationships.
Now let's look at ancient India, which offers another really fascinating example of a culture with a unique approach to sexuality.
Ancient Indian society, As we can see from texts like the Kama Sutra, they had a really rich, multifaceted understanding of sexuality. They actually viewed it as one of the 4 goals of life,
Right.
along with dharma, artha, and moksha.
The Kama Sutra itself, which is often mistakenly perceived as just a manual of sexual techniques,
Right.
is actually a really comprehensive treatise on love, desire, and just like the art of living. It really goes into the emotional, psychological, and spiritual dimensions of human sexuality.
Absolutely. I mean, it goes way beyond just the mechanics of sex.
Yes.
It offers guidance on everything from, choosing a partner to maintaining a harmonious relationship to, cultivating sensuality and pleasure.
This openness towards sexuality is also reflected in ancient Indian art,
Yeah.
particularly those really intricate and often explicit carvings
Right.
found on temples, like the ones at Khajuraho and Konark.
Yeah. Those temples, they actually feature depictions of, all sorts of sexual positions and acts, even group scenes, which really suggests that sexuality was integrated
Right.
into their religious and cultural practices.
It really challenges the idea that ancient societies were universally repressed or prudish when it came to sex.
Exactly. I think these examples
Right.
from Egypt, Greece, and India,
Yeah.
they show just how wide the range of attitudes and practices that existed in the ancient world really was.
Right. Now, before we get to the Middle Ages, I think it's worth thinking about early humans before these civilizations, how they might have perceived sexuality.
Yeah. I mean, evidence from prehistoric times, it is limited.
Right.
But we can get some insights from archaeological discoveries, things like the Venus figurines.
Right. Those small statuettes. Often depicting women with, exaggerated breasts, hips, and vulvas.
Yeah.
They date back tens of thousands of years.
Right.
And are found in different regions across Europe and Asia.
And I think their widespread presence suggests a possible connection to fertility rituals or beliefs about women's reproductive power.
It's amazing to try to imagine, like, how early humans who were so connected to nature and the cycles of life and death, how they might have incorporated sexuality into their worldview,
Yeah. Given how central reproduction was to their survival,
Right.
it seems likely that they had beliefs and practices related to fertility and, continuing their lineage.
Of course, we can only speculate
Right.
based on what little evidence we have.
Yeah.
But it's a reminder of the long and complex history of human sexuality.
Yeah. It's sort of a bridge, right? Yeah.
Between, our modern understanding and that distant past, highlighting, I think, our enduring fascination with sex and its role in society.
Now, as we transition to the Middle Ages in Europe, we enter a period marked by significant shifts in attitudes towards sexuality, largely due to the growing influence of Christianity.
Right. The early church fathers,
Yeah.
People like St. Augustine of Hippo, they were really pivotal in shaping Christian views on sexuality. Augustine's own struggles with lust and his, subsequent embrace of celibacy, that really influenced his theological writings.
Yeah. He really emphasized original sin, viewing sexual desire as, part of humanity's fallen nature. And he advocated for really strict control over bodily impulses.
Yeah.
His focus on chastity and suppressing sexual desire, that became like a cornerstone of Christian morality, particularly for the clergy who were expected to live celibate lives,
And the church's teachings, they permeated medieval society, shaping those norms and expectations surrounding sexual behavior. Marriage became the only acceptable context for sexual activity.
Right.
It was mainly for procreation.
Yeah. Sex outside of marriage was strictly forbidden.
Right.
And even within marriage, if it wasn't specifically aimed at having children, it was often frowned upon.
Yeah. And to enforce these rules, the church established mechanisms like confession and penitentials.
Yeah. Penitentials, those were, they were basically guides that outlined different sins and the penances
Right, yeah.
for those sins.
Yeah. They provided this really detailed framework for regulating sexual behavior, listing specific acts, thoughts even, that were considered transgressions, and prescribing punishments, ranging from fasting to acts of charity to, like, physical self-gratification.
Right.
This control. An association of sex with sin, it marked a real departure from the relative openness that we saw in some ancient cultures.
Yeah. I mean, it's important to remember, though, that even within this, stricter framework, there were still nuances, contradictions.
Yeah.
Human desire and lived experience don't always fit into these neat moral codes.
Right. Good example is the concept of courtly love,
Yeah.
which emerged in the 12th century, particularly within those aristocratic courts of Europe.
Right. Courtly love was this, I guess you could say, literary and cultural ideal that romanticized, the relationship between a knight and a lady. Typically, she was a married woman, of higher social standing. It emphasized chivalry, adoration, emotional longing, rather than physical consummation.
Yeah. The knight would perform all these valiant deeds
Yeah.
in the name of his lady, who would remain, chaste and unattainable.
Right, and courtly love. While it seems to clash with the church's teachings on chastity, it actually offered, like an outlet for exploring love, desire, longing, but within the confines of, the social and religious norms.
It's a fascinating example of how, even with restrictive social structures, human creativity and the search for emotional fulfillment, they find a way.
Yeah, it highlights the power of love and desire, even when you can't openly express your sexuality.
Another interesting contradiction is when you look at the art and symbolism found within medieval churches. Despite promoting chastity, these spaces often featured imagery related to sexuality.
Right, like the Sheelagh gig carvings, mostly found in Ireland and Britain.
Right. These stone figures typically depict women with, exaggerated and exposed genitalia.
Right, and their purpose is still debated, among scholars.
Right.
Some theories suggest that they might have been fertility symbols, or protective charms, or even warnings about the dangers of lust.
Yeah, I mean, their presence in churches is pretty intriguing.
Yeah, and similarly, you have the gargoyles.
Right.
Get grotesque.
The fantastical, often monstrous creatures adorning so many medieval cathedrals. They often had, these suggestive poses.
Yeah. And while their main purpose was probably architectural or symbolic, some people think that they also served as reminders of sin, temptation, the need for redemption.
Right. I mean, putting this imagery within these sacred spaces, it highlights that complex relationship between sexuality and spirituality in medieval Europe.
Yeah.
Even though the church was trying to control sexual behavior, that human fascination with sex, its power, it couldn't be completely erased.
Exactly. It shows that, even in periods where we think of repression being dominant, sexuality still finds a way to express itself.
Right. In all sorts of forms.
Yeah, and sometimes in unexpected places.
Now, as we move into the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, we see a gradual shift away from the church's dominance and towards a more humanist and rational approach to understanding the world, including human sexuality.
The Renaissance, starting in the 14th century, it marked a renewed interest in classical antiquity, a rediscovery of, ancient Greek and Roman art, literature, philosophy.
Right, yeah. And this revival had a profound impact on European thought and culture, leading to a greater emphasis on human reason, observation, experience.
And in art, you see this in the work of, the Renaissance masters.
Yeah.
People like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, who really celebrated the beauty and complexity of the human form.
Michelangelo's David, for instance.
Right.
With its incredibly accurate and idealized depiction of the male nude.
Yeah.
Really shows that fascination with the human body.
Right. And Leonardo's anatomical drawings, which were based on meticulous dissection and observation, they demonstrate this newfound interest in, really understanding how the human body works, including its sexual organs.
Right. Alongside those artistic developments, the Renaissance also saw a renewed interest in classical literature, including texts that explored love, desire, sexuality. Much more, frankly, than what we saw in medieval Europe. Works like Ovid's Ars Amatoria, which is this playful and often explicit guide to seduction and love affairs. Those were rediscovered and circulated among intellectuals and artists.
And authors like Boccaccio, in his collection of tales, the Decameron,
Right.
he really challenged the conventional morality of the time, depicted this huge range of human experiences, including those related to love, lust, and infidelity.
Those literary explorations contributed to a more nuanced, and less judgmental view of human sexuality.
Yeah.
One that acknowledged, the complexities of desire and human behavior.
Right.
Then the Enlightenment, which
Yeah.
followed the Renaissance. It really furthered that shift
Yeah.
towards a more rational and secular understanding of the world.
Enlightenment thinkers, they focused on reason, individual liberty, the pursuit of knowledge. They questioned traditional authority, including the church, and really advocated for freedom of thought and expression.
And this focus on individual autonomy.
Yeah.
It extended to sexuality with thinkers like John Locke,
Yeah.
who argued for the separation of church and state
Right.
and the right to personal privacy.
And you have thinkers like Mary Wollstonecraft,
Mm-hmm.
a pioneering feminist, challenging, those traditional gender roles, advocating for a women's right to education, self-determination, including control over their bodies
Yeah.
and their sexuality.
Right. These Enlightenment ideals, they didn't immediately transform social norms,
Right.
but they really laid the groundwork for future challenges
Yeah.
to traditional sexual morality
Yeah.
and really paved the way
Yeah.
for more progressive understanding
Yeah.
of human sexuality.
Right. I think it's fair to say that the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, they mark a real turning point in European history, shifting the focus away from religious dogma
Mm-hmm.
and toward this more humanist, more empirical approach
Mm-hmm.
to understanding ourselves and the world around us,
Right.
including, our sexual natures.
Right.
While we've been focusing mainly on Western perspectives so far, it's important to remember that Eastern cultures, with their diverse religious and philosophical traditions, they've developed their own unique and often complex approaches to sexuality.
Absolutely. Like, let's look at ancient China, a civilization with such a long history of philosophical and cultural development, which has definitely shaped its views on sexuality over the centuries.
Confucianism, which is one of the most influential philosophical schools in China, really played a big role in shaping those social norms and attitudes towards sex.
Yeah. Confucius himself really emphasized things like social harmony, filial piety, respect for elders, and these values, they extended to the realm of sexuality as well.
Right. Confucianism saw marriage and family as the foundation for a stable and prosperous society. And so, sexual behavior was regulated accordingly.
Arranged marriages were pretty common, and the main purpose of marriage was to have kids, especially sons, to keep that family lineage going.
Exactly. That focus on patrilineal descent, carrying on the family name, it led to a strong preference for sons and, unfortunately, kind of a devaluation of daughters.
Now, while Confucianism stressed restraint and social order, Taoism, another important philosophy in China, it offered a different view on sexuality.
Yeah, Taoism saw sexuality as a natural and vital force that was connected to this flow of energy, or qi, in the universe.
So Taoist practices, like sexual alchemy, tried to harness and cultivate this energy for both spiritual and physical well-being.
Right. They believed that through certain techniques and rituals, individuals could transform sexual energy into this higher form of energy, promoting longevity, vitality, and even, spiritual enlightenment.
So you have Confucianism, which focused on regulating sexual behavior within marriage and social hierarchy, and then Taoism, which explored sexuality as a source of power and transcendence.
Exactly. It really shows the diversity of thought and practice that existed even within ancient Chinese culture.
And that complexity is also seen in Chinese art and literature, where we find both really explicit depictions of sexuality and these more subtle explorations of desire and intimacy.
Erotic art, while often produced for a private audience, flourished during various periods of Chinese history, like the Spring Palace pictures, for example. It's a series of erotic paintings and illustrations that circulated among the elite.
And literary works like The Golden Lotus, this classic novel from the Ming Dynasty, explored all the intricacies of human relationships, including love, lust, infidelity, and, the consequences of uncontrolled desire.
These examples show that despite the social and moral constraints that Confucianism imposed, Chinese culture also had this tradition of, acknowledging and exploring the more complex aspects of human sexuality.
Okay, so now let's move on to Japan, another East Asian culture, with its own unique and rich history when it comes to sexual norms.
Yeah, Japan's mix of indigenous Shinto beliefs and Buddhist teachings, which they adopted from China and Korea, really shaped their views on sexuality in some really distinct ways.
Shinto, the native religion of Japan, puts a lot of emphasis on purity, harmony with nature, and this interconnectedness of everything.
And in that Shinto worldview, sexuality isn't seen as inherently sinful or bad, but as just this natural part of life, a force that can be harnessed for both pleasure and for spiritual purposes.
Then you have Buddhism, which came to Japan from China and Korea around the 6th century, and it brought concepts like karma, rebirth, and, the pursuit of enlightenment.
And while Buddhism doesn't necessarily condemn sexuality, it does encourage moderation and detachment from all those worldly desires, including, of course, sexual desire, as a way to reach spiritual liberation.
So you have this interesting dynamic between these two traditions, with Shinto accepting sexuality and Buddhism stressing detachment.
And you see that really clearly during the Edo period, which was a time of relative peace and stability in Japan, lasting from the 17th to the 19th century.
During that time, you saw the rise of big urban centers like Edo, which is modern-day Tokyo, and with that came this flourishing of art, culture, entertainment, including the emergence of pleasure quarters, like the Yoshiwara district.
The Yoshiwara was basically a licensed red light district where these courtesans, called orin, entertained wealthy patrons with music, dance, conversation, and, sexual services.
And even though the Yoshiwara was regulated and controlled by the authorities, it became a center for cultural innovation, influencing things like fashion, art, literature, and even theater.
Those orin, they were highly trained in the arts, considered real fashion icons. Their elaborate hairstyles, makeup, and kimonos, they set trends throughout Japanese society.
And the Yoshiwara itself inspired countless works of art and literature, including woodblock prints called ukiyo-e, which often showed scenes from those pleasure quarters.
And one specific genre of ukiyo-e, known as shunga, focused specifically on erotic themes, depicting a wide range of sexual acts and fantasies.
Shunga, which translates to spring pictures, they were popular among people from all walks of life, and were often made by very famous artists.
And these prints served not just as a source of erotic stimulation, but also as a way for people to learn about sex and as a reflection of the sexual practices and attitudes of that time.
Another art form that really took off during the Edo period and reflected those changing sexual norms was kabuki theater.
Kabuki, which started in the early 17th century, is a very stylized form of Japanese theater that's famous for its costumes, dramatic makeup, and these really dynamic performances.
And a lot of kabuki plays dealt with romantic themes and explored the complexities of human relationships, like love, desire, jealousy, and betrayal.
And one really unique thing about kabuki is this tradition of onagata, which are male actors who specialize in playing female roles.
Those onagata were super skilled performers who could embody all those nuances of female gestures, speech, and emotions, really captivating audiences with their artistry.
So kabuki, through its exploration of love, desire, and gender fluidity, provided this space for examining the multifaceted nature of human sexuality within the context of Edo society.
Before we get to the Victorian era, I think it's really important to acknowledge the rich and diverse sexual norms that existed in pre-colonial Africa and among indigenous societies all over the world.
Absolutely. These cultures, which are often left out of the traditional historical narratives, had their own unique perspectives on sexuality that were shaped by their environments, beliefs, and social structures.
A lot of pre-colonial African societies, for example, really celebrated fertility and made sexuality part of their rituals and ceremony.
Yeah, and in some cultures, those initiation rites for young people included sexual education and the exploration of pleasure.
And their ideas about gender roles and identities were often more fluid than in Western cultures, with some societies recognizing multiple genders and being accepting of same-sex relationships.
Like the Igbo people of southeastern Nigeria, for instance, they had this tradition of nogugu, who were individuals assigned male at birth but lived as women, taking on those female roles and responsibilities.
And similarly, in many Native American cultures, individuals who identified with a gender different from their assigned sex were recognized and respected as two-spirit people.
These examples really show that diversity in gender identity and sexual orientation is not just a modern idea. It's been around throughout human history in all sorts of cultures.
Sadly, when European colonialism arrived, it had this devastating impact on so many of these cultures, including their views on sexuality.
Yeah, those colonial powers often forced their own values and beliefs onto these people, leading to the suppression of indigenous traditions and the criminalization of some practices.
The introduction of Christianity and Islam, along with those laws against homosexuality, caused a lot of cultural damage and had lasting effects.
And while there are efforts to reclaim and celebrate indigenous sexual norms and identities, the damage from colonialism is undeniable.
It's a reminder that we need to respect cultural diversity, understand the historical context that shaped different societies' views on sexuality, and actively work to undo the harm caused by colonization. All right, shifting our focus back to Europe now, we enter the Victorian era. a time often associated with sexual repression and these really strict moral codes.
Yeah, Victorian Britain under Queen Victoria's reign from 1837 to 1901 saw a big comeback of conservative values and a tightening of social norms, particularly around sex and proper behavior.
Yeah, talking about sex openly was taboo, and modesty, self-restraint, and clearly defined gender roles were incredibly important.
Women were supposed to be pure, passive, and dedicated to their domestic lives, while men were expected to be strong, rational, and morally upright, at least in public.
And all this emphasis on respectability and suppressing sexuality created this environment of silence and shame around sex, which led to a lot of misinformation and anxiety.
Sex education was pretty limited back then. So many people, especially women, were left in the dark about their own bodies and sexual health.
But even with this facade of repression, the Victorian era had its contradictions and hidden sexualities.
Yeah, while public discussion of sex was discouraged, prostitution was thriving, especially in big cities like London.
And there's a growing market for erotic literature and art that circulated secretly among those who wanted to explore their desires outside those societal norms.
The invention of photography also added fuel to the fire, because it made it easier to create explicit images, leading to this kind of underground world of sexual expression.
That tension between repression and transgression played out in all sorts of ways throughout Victorian society.
We see it in the literature of the time, with authors like Oscar Wilde and Thomas Hardy subtly critiquing social conventions and exploring the consequences of desire.
Wilde's own life and the trials he faced because of his homosexuality really exposed the hypocrisy of Victorian morality.
And Hardy's novels, which often had characters struggling with societal expectations and the complexities of love and desire, challenged those prevailing norms.
It just goes to show that even when you try to repress it, human desire and the need for sexual expression always find a way to come out.
Absolutely. The Victorian era, despite its attempts at control, shows you can't really suppress such a fundamental part of human nature.
Now, along with those cultural shifts, the 19th century also saw the beginning of a more scientific approach to understanding sexuality.
Right. Pioneers like Havelock Ellis and Sigmund Freud started studying human sexuality in a systematic way, challenging Victorian taboos and paving the way for modern sexology.
Ellis's research on sexual behavior and Freud's theories about the unconscious mind and how sexuality develops had a huge impact on how we view sexuality today.
Yeah, they helped move the conversation away from just moral judgments and towards this more nuanced understanding of the biological, psychological, and social factors that shape our sexualities.
So the Victorian era, it's this really complex and contradictory period, a time that tried to enforce strict moral codes while also struggling with the realities of human desire and these new ways of thinking about sexuality.
It's a key era that sets the stage for all the big changes that happened in the 20th century.
And speaking of the 20th century, this is when we see the rise and influence of pornography really take shape, starting with those magazines like Playboy and Penthouse.
Right, and those magazines, while controversial, played a big role in challenging conservative attitudes and bringing that erotic content into the mainstream.
Playboy, founded by Hugh Hefner in 1953, presented this sophisticated mix of nude photography, articles, interviews, and fiction.
It promoted a lifestyle that embraced sexual freedom and challenged the traditional boundaries between erotica and intellectual content.
Penthouse, which came along in 1965, pushed the envelope even further with its more explicit content, creating competition and raising the bar for what was considered acceptable in print media.
And these magazines sparked all these debates about morality, censorship, and freedom of expression, forcing society to confront its evolving views on sexuality.
They also started discussions about gender dynamics and the objectification of women, which contributed to the feminist movement's critique of media representations.
And the influence of those magazines, it went way beyond their pages, shaping cultural attitudes and paving the way for more liberalization in the years to come.
And that move towards liberalization really gained momentum with those landmark legal changes that happened in Denmark in 1969.
That's right. Denmark became the very first country in the world to legalize both pictures and written pornography, basically decriminalizing the production and distribution of explicit material.
This was a controversial move, but it was driven by this desire to reduce the crime associated with the black market and to encourage open discussions about sexuality.
And it had a major cultural impact, leading to a surge in the production of adult films, magazines, and literature, making Denmark a real center for the pornography industry.
And this shift towards liberalization had a ripple effect around the world, influencing other countries to rethink their laws and contributing to a global trend towards greater acceptance of explicit content.
Of course, there were critics of these changes. There were a lot of moral debates about the potential negative impacts of pornography on society, individual behavior, and traditional values.
But despite those concerns, the trend towards liberalization kept going, driven in part by all the technological advancements that made it easier than ever to access pornography.
The arrival of VHS cassettes in the late 1970s completely changed how people consumed adult content, making it possible to watch it privately at home.
And that shift from public theaters to home viewing further reduced the stigma around pornography and contributed to its growing acceptance as a form of entertainment.
And then, of course, you have the internet, which completely revolutionized the landscape of pornography and how it affects society.
The internet's emergence in the mid-1990s led to this huge explosion in online pornography, making it more accessible than ever before in history.
That incredible level of access, combined with the anonymity and convenience of the internet, really fueled the growth of the online adult industry.
And that, in turn, led to major technological advancements in things like streaming video, online payment systems, and content delivery networks. The amount of traffic from the online adult industry really pushed internet service providers, to improve their bandwidth and infrastructure, which ended up benefiting all internet users.
Right, and the need for those discrete and secure transactions, well, that led to improvements in encryption and online payment security. So it really shaped the digital world that we know today.
But obviously, along with those technological advances came, a whole new set of social and cultural challenges related to online pornography.
Right, the ease of access raised concerns about, kids being exposed to it, and just the sheer volume of content. Well, it contributed to those debates about desensitization and addiction.
And there were also ethical and legal questions that emerged, like piracy, the spread of non-consensual content, and the exploitation of performers.
Governments and organizations worldwide have been trying to figure out how to regulate online pornography. Trying to balance freedom of expression with the need to protect people who are vulnerable.
Yeah, it's a really complex debate with no easy solutions, and it shows just how deeply technology has changed our relationship with sexuality in this digital age.
And while we've talked about the impact of pornography on sexual norms, it's important to remember that the internet has influenced our understanding and experience of sexuality in many other ways, too.
Absolutely. I mean, the internet has made it possible for ideas and cultures to be exchanged globally, which has led to both, the merging and clashing of norms when it comes to sexuality.
Right. We're seeing more awareness and acceptance of different sexualities and gender identities, and that's partly because of online communities and social media.
Yeah, these online spaces give people opportunities to connect with others who share similar views, to share their experiences, and to learn about different perspectives on sex and relationships.
They've been especially important for LGBTQ+ individuals who might face discrimination or feel isolated in their offline lives. It allows them to find support and build a community.
But at the same time, this increased visibility and acceptance has also been met with resistance and backlash from people who hold more traditional or conservative views.
We see debates happening about LGBTQ+ rights, marriage equality, and including diverse gender identities in education and law.
And these debates highlight how sexual norms are always evolving and the challenges of trying to reconcile traditional values with those changing societal attitudes.
Technology has also completely changed how people meet, connect, and form relationships, leading to both new opportunities and new challenges in the world of love and intimacy.
Online dating apps are becoming so popular, offering new ways to find partners and explore romantic connections.
These apps allow people to filter potential partners based on things like shared interests, values, and relationship goals. It gives them more options and might make it easier to find a good match.
And social media platforms have also played a role in shaping modern relationships, providing spaces for people to connect, share their lives, and even flirt and, explore romantic interests.
But these online platforms can also blur the lines between our public and private lives. And they can contribute to these unrealistic expectations and comparisons,
Right.
which can lead to anxiety and problems in relationships.
It's pretty clear that the digital age has both amplified and complicated our experiences with sexuality and relationships.
Right. It's this constantly changing landscape that requires us to be aware, think critically, and act ethically as we navigate new technologies and social dynamics.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the evolution of sexual norms, I think it's crucial to reflect on what we've learned and how understanding this history can inform our approach to sexuality in the present and the future.
Throughout history, we've seen that sexual norms are not fixed. They're always being shaped by social, cultural, religious, and technological forces.
Exactly what was considered taboo or unacceptable in one time period might be completely normal in another, and practices that were once celebrated might later be condemned.
This historical perspective reminds us that our own current attitudes and beliefs about sexuality are also a product of our time and culture, and they're likely to continue changing.
It also shows how important it is to approach sexuality with an open mind, a willingness to learn, and a respect for diversity.
We should recognize that there's no single right way to experience or express sexuality, and that individuals have the right to make their own choices about their bodies and their relationships.
It's also essential to have open and honest conversations about sex education, consent, healthy relationships, and the ethical implications of new technologies.
By fostering a culture of dialogue, respect, and informed decision-making, we can create a more inclusive and equitable society where people can explore their sexuality in a safe and authentic way.
This deep dive has definitely given us all a lot to think about, and I hope it inspires you to keep exploring this really fascinating and always evolving aspect of human experience.
Remember that by understanding the past, we can better navigate the present and help create a future where sexuality is approached with greater knowledge, compassion, and respect.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.